Hi, and welcome to our third session of Environmental Law and Policy. Last time we established how courts, using the common law of nuisance, can apply that body of law to environmental disputes, such as air pollution. We are going to come back in a few minutes and build on those insights. But before we do, let's take a brief time out and appreciate there's an entirely different way governments can address environmental issues. They can do so under something called the police power. The police power, by the way, doesn't have anything to do necessarily with the police or the criminal law, but instead is the ability of governments at all levels, local governments, regional governments, national governments, simply to adopt rules for the overall public welfare, for the public good. One of the classic uses of the police power is zoning. And perhaps the most famous case in the United States involving the constitutionality of zoning is this 1926 case, Village of Euclid versus Ambler Realty, that I had you read. Let's just step back for a moment and make sure we all have a visual of what zoning looks like. This is a picture of an area, a modern day area in the United States that is undoubtedly zoned residential. All the houses look the same. Those are the roofs of houses that probably are, each one of them, single-family residences. If you pull back a little bit, you'll see all those houses clustered together in the bottom half of the screen. But in the top half, you'll notice, there's some other structures. They look bigger roof lines. Those might be things like factories that have more traffic with trucks going back and forth, that maybe make more noise, that emit smoke. And one of the beauties of zoning is that you could separate these uses to prevent what otherwise might end up in court as nuisance litigation. In the 1920s, the village of Euclid, which was a small town just outside of Cleveland, Ohio, in the American Midwest, adopted just such a zoning ordinance. It was challenged by companies that had real estate in areas that had been zoned residential because they wanted to sell their property to willing buyers who wanted to put factories there. The effect of the zoning ordinance was to make their property worth much less. And they argued that this really violated their fundamental liberty and their property rights to do what they wanted with their own land. It was such a violation that it was thought to violate, under the U.S. Constitution, something known as due process. In Village of Euclid, the Supreme Court rejected that idea and said that even though a public law enacted under the police power causes your land to be worthless because of public interest considerations, that does not conflict with fundamental notions of property or liberty in the United States under the Due Process Clause. That's an important thing to keep in mind, and we'll talk about the theoretical significance of this when we meet next time, when we have a theory session. But do realize there's another way through the police power to address environmental problems. Let's go back, though, and build on our insights from nuisance law. I want to do so by looking at a very famous pair of disputes that arises in the American Midwest not far from Cleveland, Ohio, this time in the city of Chicago. The city of Chicago, around the turn of the 20th century, in the very late 1800s and early 1900s, had a problem. They had a lot of garbage and sewage in the city, not just from the residents that lived there, but Chicago is famous for its stockyards and its slaughterhouses, and there was a lot of waste that were generated by those industries. Most of it was thrown into the rivers that went through the town. And the rivers tended to flow into Lake Michigan. Chicago is on the shores of Lake Michigan, and significantly, Chicago gets its drinking water from Lake Michigan. In the late 1800s, a big storm caused a huge amount of this garbage to go into Lake Michigan, and the people were afraid that their water supply would be contaminated by all of this waste, including the animal waste, that could lead to diseases like typhoid. This led them to undertake a huge engineering project in which they would build large canals known as the Chicago Sanitary and Ship Canals. And the idea is water would now be taken from Lake Michigan, poured into these canals, and the course of the rivers, instead of flowing into Lake Michigan, would be reversed. And water would be forced down through these rivers into the Mississippi River. And the waste from the city of Chicago could now be flushed down this river with lots more water coming from the Great Lakes and the Lake Michigan into the Mississippi River. The result, as you might expect, were some environmental problems. The first arose in the very early 1900s, where a city downstream on the Mississippi, St. Louis, Missouri, was worried that this new plan by the city of Chicago would actually send things like typhoid bacillus, typhoid germs down the river, causing increases in typhoid fever in St. Louis. And so they brought an action, citing Tennessee copper, one state against another state, to abate the nuisance. The Supreme Court in Missouri versus Illinois and City of Chicago held two important things. The first was that even though this wasn't a classic nuisance, a simple nuisance like smoke that we saw in the Tennessee copper litigation, it could be a nuisance nonetheless, even though it might involve invisible germs that no one could really see in an unusual way, presenting themselves as a nuisance. However, the court heard a lot of evidence and in the end just wasn't convinced that there really was a problem. The experts, by the way, disagreed violently. Some of them thought that so much water was added to the system that it diluted the threat of pollution. Secondly, many of them thought that the germs couldn't even survive the hundreds of miles down to St. Louis. And lastly, if you look at the epidemiological evidence, and I have a little excerpt from that in the chart next to me, you'll notice that the evidence was sort of conflicting. Even though there was some instances after the canal was opened in 1900 in which instances of typhoid fever went up, you could see even before the canal was opened that there were instances prior to its opening in which even in St. Louis there were many more cases than there were later of typhoid fever. This made the cause-effect relationship between the canal and typhoid fever fairly tenuous, so much so that the court said to the city of St. Louis, "You just didn't prove your case. It could be a nuisance if you proved it, but you didn't in this case." And so relief was denied. Fast forward almost over a century later, we're still in Chicago and we're still looking at this ship canal. But now there's another problem. 10 or 20 or 30 years before modern times, the United States introduced into the southern Mississippi states a certain type of carp from Asia, known as Asian carp. It was actually brought in with the blessings of our Environmental Protection Agency as a way to fight certain algae that was threatening catfish farmers in the lower Mississippi states. The problem is, as is often the case when you fool with Mother Nature, that these exotic species, the Asian carp, escaped the catfish farms where they were supposed to take care of the algae into the Mississippi River, and they began infiltrating up the entire system. These fish, by the way, can be huge. They can weigh up to 50 pounds. They're voracious eaters, and they have spread all the way up the Mississippi River, and right now they can be found just outside the city of Chicago. The state of Michigan was terrified that if these fish use this canal system to actually get into Lake Michigan and the Great Lakes, they could destroy what is a $7 billion commercial fishery, not to mention tourism industry based on recreational fishery that exists in the Great Lakes. The country of Canada was worried about the exact same thing. So the state of Michigan sued the city of Chicago and the state of Illinois and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, a federal agency that administers much of this interstate river, the Mississippi, requiring them to do more to stop the spread of the Asian carp. They must not be allowed to get into the Great Lakes. That would be a nuisance. And the plaintiffs wanted an injunction. They wanted the court to order the government to do more to prevent this from happening, maybe even closing the locks altogether and not using this system for disposal of waste into the Mississippi. The Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals, a federal court that sits in Chicago, heard this case, and in 2011 did two very interesting things. The first thing is it rejected the arguments by the city of Chicago and others that this was not a nuisance at all, because it wasn't a classic nuisance like smoke that we saw in Tennessee copper. The court pointed out nuisances don't have to be simple or classic. They can be just something in the wrong place at the wrong time that causes an unreasonable interference. And the doctrine of nuisance is plastic enough, is flexible enough to bend to new circumstances. And even though the city didn't introduce the Asian carp, their canal system, which they built, was exacerbating the effects of the Asian carp and creating a way in which they could get into the Great Lakes. That definitely is and could be a nuisance. But the second interesting thing was that the court then had to consider whether or not to issue an injunction. And it noted that lots of other governments, the city government, the state government in Illinois, the federal U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, in fact had hundreds and hundreds of people working on this problem and had invested hundreds of millions of dollars in attempts to stop the Asian carp. There were efforts to poison the fish. There were electric barrier gates put in the canals just outside the city of Chicago. And so far, that seemed to have worked. Given all this exercise of the police power by these other entities, the court said, if we're thinking how to coordinate the common law of nuisance with this other body of law, the police power, regulatory body of law, we think an injunction might actually do more harm than good. There's already a lot of efforts going on, and if we had an injunction, it might cause everybody to wonder what to do next rather than taking action. So we choose not to give an injunction and let the current regulatory system under the police power continue in its way. But then the court added a very significant thing. It said, if the police power approach to this stops working because, let's say, there's no more budget appropriated for it in Washington, D.C., or the governmental agencies lose the political will to fight it, then we invite the plaintiffs to come right back into court, and we'll entertain this as a nuisance and seriously entertain an injunction. And in that way, we'll coordinate these two bodies of law. Next time we meet, we're going to talk about theory and insights into policy that we can glean from all of this, the police power cases, the nuisance cases, and get some other working overall approaches to the theoretical aspects of environmental law. I'll see you then.